Quick, kneel down and confess. You thieving little maid, tell all these people how you stole from me." Bianca Sartori's voice cut through the crystal-lit ballroom of Chicago's finest hotel as her manicured fingers twisted into the hair of Delia Vance, forcing the 27-year-old housekeeper to her knees before 200 guests. Delia, thin, exhausted, still in the same plain gray dress she'd worn scrubbing floors that morning, clutched her worn handbag and didn't cry. She only lifted her chin. Because tonight Bianca believed she had won everything. She believed the Fontaine empire had crumbled. She believed Rocco Fontaine, the 37-year-old mafia boss she was meant to marry. The ruthless man who once ruled every port and shadow in this city had lost it all, exactly as he'd let her believe. And she believed the men she'd quietly paid had made certain he wouldn't walk through a door again, so she snatched the microphone and screamed her accusation for all 200 to hear. Then the great doors opened, and Rocco Fontaine walked in, alive and untouched, his cold eyes fixed on the woman who thought she had buried him. If you believe every lie eventually returns to the one who told it, then like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss a story where the powerless finally find their power. Now let's go back 41 days, to a cold October rain in Chicago, and see how it all began. The October rain poured over Chicago as though the sky itself were trying to wash away something that could never truly be cleansed. And inside the gleaming black car, moving slowly through streets drenched in reflected light, Rocco Fontaine sat in silence, one hand resting on a small wooden box lined with red velvet. At 37, he had learned to wield silence like a weapon, and the weight of it was enough to keep even his loyal driver, Tommy Riggs, from uttering a single word throughout the ride back to the estate. The empire the Fontaine family had built stretched across the docks on the city's south side, where containers of legitimate cargo carrying steel, coffee, and machinery were stacked beneath sickly yellow lights, while beneath that polished exterior lay an underground network no one dared name, a sprawling web of influence that dictated everything from the illicit gambling halls in the neon-lit downtown alleys to the silent political favors traded in mahogany-paneled boardrooms. It was an empire built on whispers, where loyalty was the currency and a single misstep could erase a man's existence without a trace left for the police to find. Rocco stood at the absolute apex of this dark kingdom, a solitary monarch who commanded an army of shadows. He did not rule through the chaotic, bloody violence of his predecessors. Rather, he controlled the city with a calculated restraint that made him infinitely more dangerous. He knew the price of every politician, the secret of every judge, and the breaking point of every rival. Yet he kept his own hands impeccably clean, causing streams of money moving through dozens of shell companies, agreements sealed with handshakes instead of signatures, and men who understood that Rocco Fontaine's word carried more weight than any contract ever could. People feared him not because he was loud, but because he was cold and precise, because he never issued the same warning twice, because in the world he ruled, loyalty was rewarded generously, while betrayal was never given a second chance. That afternoon, he should have remained in his office high above the city, in the glass tower, overlooking Lake Michigan until long after dark, because the port operation was entering its most delicate stage in years. But a meeting had ended earlier than expected, giving him an excuse to do something he rarely allowed himself to do. He went home early, and he brought a gift with him. The wooden box on his lap held an old gold pocket watch, its surface dimmed by time, the only possession his father had left behind before he died. Rocco had never offered it to anyone, because within the Fontaine family, the watch was more than precious metal. It was a symbol of inheritance, of absolute trust, of a promise that whoever received it would be regarded as blood. Rocco had decided to give it to Bianca Sartori, the woman he would marry in a little over 40 days. And the thought of it stirred something rare and almost tender inside a chest that had long since hardened. He believed that even a man who had built his entire life on suspicion deserved one place where he could lay down his trust, and he had chosen Bianca to be that place. The car stopped before the black iron gates of the estate in the Gold Coast, where rows of bare trees trembled beneath the rain, and the light spilling from the tall windows cast a warmth that stood in sharp contrast to the gray sky outside. Instead of allowing the guards to open the main gates and announce his arrival with the usual commotion, Rocco motioned for Tommy to stop some distance away. Then he stepped out alone, turned up the collar of his expensive wool coat against the rain, and circled toward the side entrance that led directly into the kitchen and the servants' corridor. He wanted it to be a surprise, and in the mind of a man who had spent years controlling an entire underworld, that small surprise carried a gentleness he couldn't quite put into words. Inside the estate, the air held the scent of polished wood and fresh lilies arranged in crystal vases, while somewhere near the kitchen at the far end of the hall came the faint clatter of dishes and the warm aroma of food. Rocco tightened his grip around the wooden box, his leather shoes making no sound against the gleaming marble floor, and he moved toward those signs of life with the faintest hint of a smile beginning at the corner of his mouth, never imagining that only a few steps ahead, the world he had spent so many years building and protecting was about to crack beneath the roof of his own home on an October afternoon that had seemed so peaceful. Rocco stopped at the bend in the servants' corridor, hidden in the darkness of a recessed alcove untouched by the light, because the voice carrying from the grand dining room ahead had brought his steps to an abrupt halt. It was Bianca's voice, but not the sweet tone he was accustomed to hearing each evening. This voice was sharp and cold, steeped in contempt, the voice of someone accustomed to giving orders and watching others lower their heads. Through the narrow opening of the half-closed door, Rocco saw Bianca standing beside the long table draped in white linen, holding a length of silk imported from Italy for the wedding, while a few steps away stood Delia Vance, the young maid in a faded gray uniform, both hands gripping a trembling tray of tea. Bianca looked at the girl as though she were a stain on the floor, then unleashed a stream of cruel words, telling her not to stand near the wedding fabric with those filthy hands she used for scrubbing, saying the stench of poverty and dishwater clinging to her might seep into the silk and ruin the entire ceremony, saying that someone like her ought to know her place and press herself into a corner, instead of hovering around expensive things she would never be able to touch in her lifetime. Delia didn't argue. She only lowered her head and quietly set the tea tray on a side table, and that patient silence seemed to irritate Bianca even more, because she stepped closer and lowered her voice into a whisper more poisonous than any shout. She told Delia she should be grateful she was still allowed to work in this house, that one word from her would be enough to throw her into the street, that people like her were born to serve and not to exist within the sight of refined people. Delia's narrow shoulders trembled, but it wasn't her fear that caught Rocco's attention. It was the way she lifted her head for one brief moment. There was no hatred in her eyes, no pleading, only a quiet dignity that no amount of humiliation could wear away, as though somewhere deep inside this battered young woman, something still remained whole, something Bianca, with all her money and influence, would never be able to reach. And then, in that fragile instant, Delia's eyes accidentally met Rocco's gaze from the darkness of the corridor. The girl froze, and a deep confusion and shame crossed her face, not because she had been caught doing something wrong, but because she hadn't wanted this man to witness her being degraded so completely. She hadn't wanted anyone to see the moment she was pushed beneath the level of a human being. Delia quickly lowered her eyes and retreated silently toward the kitchen, leaving Rocco standing there as a slow, smoldering fury rose inside his chest, the kind of anger he had spent his entire life learning to restrain and transform into cold calculation instead of letting it erupt. He didn't storm into the room. He didn't shout. He didn't smash anything, because years spent ruling a world where every rash reaction could be paid for in blood had taught him that explosive rage was a luxury a man like him couldn't afford. He drew a deep breath, tightened his hand around the wooden box, holding his father's watch until his knuckles turned white, then stepped out of the darkness and walked directly into the dining room, his face so calm it was frightening. The instant Bianca saw him, she changed as though someone had flipped an invisible switch. The cruel mask vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by a radiant, warm smile. She dropped the silk onto the table, hurried toward him, and wrapped both hands around his arm, her voice turning sweet as honey as she said he had surprised her by coming home so early without warning, that she had missed him all day. Then she tilted her head and rested it against his shoulder, with such perfect tenderness that, had Rocco not witnessed what had just happened with his own eyes, he might have believed she was the kindest woman alive. Rocco allowed her to cling to his arm, but his eyes remained fixed on Delia's slender figure, disappearing behind the kitchen door. And inside the mind of a man who had once believed he could see through every kind of person, a cold question began to form. If Bianca could change her face so completely in a single instant, then which of those two faces was truly hers? Rocco claimed that he needed to handle some urgent paperwork in order to pull himself free from Bianca's embrace, and she didn't suspect a thing. She merely smiled and told him to go ahead and work, saying the two of them could have dinner together later, before turning back toward the decorators waiting in the grand sitting room. He entered his private study at the end of the hall, a room paneled in dark wood, lined with towering bookshelves, and anchored by a heavy writing desk. He set the wooden box containing his father's watch on the desktop, then lowered himself into the chair, though his mind still couldn't shake the image of Delia, bowing her head and enduring that humiliation. It was then, through the thin partition separating the study from the small adjoining parlor, that Bianca's voice carried toward him again. But this time it wasn't the commanding tone she used with servants, nor the false sweetness she reserved for him. It was a soft, intimate whisper, the voice of a woman speaking to her lover. Rocco went still, his hand freezing midway toward a stack of files, and then he heard her say a name, Julius Kane, the investment banker who had been circling the Fontaine family's port operations for nearly a year, offering financial deals that always came burdened with far too many conditions. The same man Bianca had once sworn she had met only once in her entire life. Rocco sat motionless as though turned to stone, while every word from the woman he had intended to marry poured into his ears like drops of acid. She was giggling, telling Julius not to worry, that Rocco didn't suspect a thing, that the foolish man still believed she truly loved him, that she only needed to endure him a little longer until the wedding was complete and the property agreement had been signed, and then everything would fall neatly into her hands. She said that control of the docks, the shell companies, and the entire empire Rocco had spent years building would gradually shift toward Julius exactly as the two of them had planned, and that she would receive the share she deserved for all the months she had spent, pretending to be a gentle and devoted bride. Bianca lowered her voice even further and said she was sick to death of Rocco's solemn, self-righteous manner, that he was always worrying about the lowly workers at the docks and clinging to outdated ideas about honor and loyalty, that he might be wealthy and powerful, but he was dull, rigid, and completely lacking in charm, and that she had only ever needed him as a bridge to cross, never as a man she truly wanted. By then, the anger inside Rocco's chest had hardened into something colder than ice. He didn't strike the desk. He didn't storm out. He simply reached into the inside pocket of his coat, drew out his phone, and activated the recording function with fingers so steady they were almost frightening, because years spent in a world where evidence carried more value than human life had taught him that the sharpest weapon wasn't rage, but truth preserved with care. Then Bianca's voice shifted toward something that seemed to freeze the blood in his veins, because she began speaking about the maid, about Delia. She said the girl had seen her getting into Julius's car outside a hotel the previous Friday, that Delia hadn't said a word, but Bianca was certain she had seen everything, that the girl's quiet, submissive manner made her deeply uneasy, and that she couldn't simply fire her because Rocco would grow suspicious and start asking questions, given his strange habit of treating servants as though they actually mattered. So she needed an excuse, a reason legitimate enough to remove the girl without giving him anything to challenge. And she promised she would take care of it before the wedding. Rocco closed his eyes for 1 second, while the phone continued silently capturing every word, and in that room, still as a tomb, he could hear the steady, cold rhythm of his own heart, as the woman beyond the wall went on laughing about the future she believed would belong to her, never realizing that the man she had just called a fool was sitting less than a wall away, listening to every syllable, and beginning, slowly and ruthlessly, to calculate his first move. The moment Bianca's call ended on the other side of the partition, the phone still recording in Rocco's hand began to vibrate insistently, and the name glowing on the screen told him at once that this rain-soaked afternoon was far from finished with its blows. It was Silvio Ferraro, his seasoned advisor and the man Rocco trusted more than anyone else in the entire empire, a 54-year-old who never called at this hour to discuss trivial matters. And the instant Rocco pressed the phone to his ear, the low, gravelly voice on the other end, strained tight with tension, delivered another piece of devastating news. Barely an hour earlier, dozens of federal agents had descended on the Southern Port District with search warrants, sealed off all 3 of the largest warehouses, searched every container, and confiscated row after row of shipping records. Rocco rose sharply from his chair, and, in that moment, he understood that the 2 pillars of his life had cracked almost at the same time. The woman he intended to marry was plotting to steal everything from him, while the empire he had spent years building was being torn apart, piece by piece, by the federal government before the evening had even begun. Silvio continued in a voice weighed down by barely contained concern, explaining that the real problem wasn't the raid itself, but the fact that the agent seemed to know exactly what to look for and exactly where to find it. They had gone straight to the warehouses holding the most sensitive documents, as though someone had drawn them a map in advance, and worse still, among the records they had seized were falsified shipping documents, forged seals, and expertly fabricated signatures designed to set a trap, placing both the family's legitimate operations and its hidden enterprises directly in the line of fire. Rocco tightened his grip on the phone and asked in a clipped voice whether anyone had been arrested, and Silvio's answer struck like a blade. The 2 most trusted lieutenants overseeing the port, men who had served the family for years and to whom Rocco had given his complete confidence, had been handcuffed and led away in full view of the terrified workers. What sent a chill through him wasn't the financial damage swelling with every passing minute, but the question circling relentlessly in his mind about how the federal authorities could have known so much with such precision, because only a very small number of people on the inside possessed that information. And the thought that a traitor might be hiding somewhere among those closest to him made the ground beneath his feet feel as though it might collapse. Yet even as the crisis closed in from 2 directions at once, Rocco's first thought wasn't for himself. It was for the hundreds of honest people who worked at the port, the dock hands, the forklift drivers, the warehouse employees who had names, families, and children waiting for them to bring their wages home at the end of each week. People who had never been faceless numbers on a payroll to him, but flesh and blood human beings who would bear the consequences directly if the entire port was shut down. Rocco had always operated on a solitary philosophy that separated him from the ruthless mob bosses of the past. You look at the people, not the numbers. He remembered the faces of the men who unloaded the freighters in the freezing winters, the calloused hands of the foremen who worked double shifts to put their daughters through college. To the federal government and his rival families, these workers were acceptable collateral damage in a war for power. But to Rocco, they were the very foundation of his empire. Betraying them to save his own profit margins would turn him into the exact kind of soulless corporate monster that Julius Cain represented. He knew that money could be laundered and lost territories could be reclaimed. But once a leader sacrifices the people who bleed for him, his crown turns to dust. Silvio cautiously warned him that the other members of the family council would almost certainly demand immediate layoffs to preserve the core of the empire. Some would call for mass dismissals, frozen wages, and the abandonment of those with the least power in order to protect those seated at the top. But Rocco cut him off with a firm declaration that no one was losing a job that night, that every worker was to be paid in full, and that not a single person was to be thrown into the street while the truth remained unclear. He stood in silence beside the study window, looking out across the rear courtyard, where Bianca had once dreamed aloud about an extravagant wedding celebration, and inside the mind of a man who had suffered 2 mortal blows in less than half an hour, a cold and terrible calm began to take shape. The calm of someone who understood that when every path of retreat had been sealed, the only choice left was to move forward with clear eyes and ruthless precision. Because he knew that beyond the partition, the woman humming softly to herself had no idea that the game she believed she had already won had only just begun. Less than an hour after the call, Silvio Ferraro arrived at the estate. But instead of entering through the main gates, he slipped quietly inside through the side door that led directly to the study, exactly as Rocco had instructed him over the phone, because under circumstances like these, discretion was even more valuable than speed. The 54-year-old man entered with the composure of someone who had witnessed too many storms to be shaken by anything, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his dark suit still perfectly pressed despite the lateness of the long day, and in his sharp, cold eyes rested the wisdom of a man who had spent his entire life standing behind powerful bosses, making sure they didn't commit mistakes that could cost them everything. Rocco locked the door, lowered his voice, and told him everything he had heard through the partition, then placed the phone on the desk and played the recording. Silvio sat perfectly still and listened from beginning to end. His expression didn't change when Bianca's voice filled the room with contempt for Rocco, nor did it shift when she discussed seizing control of the docks with Julius Kane. But when the recording reached the part where she spoke of removing Delia, the advisor's heavy brows drew together into a deep crease, the only sign that what he had just heard had reached even a hardened man like him. When the recording ended, Silvio removed his tortoiseshell-framed glasses, slowly polished the lenses with the corner of his handkerchief, and only then spoke in a voice as deep and solid as stone. He said that what lay inside that phone was a blade with two edges. It could become the most powerful weapon they possessed, but it could just as easily cut the hand holding it if used at the wrong moment. And for that reason, the one thing Rocco absolutely couldn't do now was rush out and confront Bianca. Silvio was the only man in the entire palm of the Fontaine Empire who possessed both the courage and the position to look Rocco dead in the eye and say, no. Where others saw a ruthless boss to be feared and obeyed without question, Silvio saw the reckless sparks of a young man whose grandfather had taught him that blood demands immediate blood. He stood like an immovable stone wall against Rocco's rising tide of vengeance, reminding him that in the high-stakes theater of the underworld, the first one to let their emotions draw their weapon is always the first one to be carried out in a box. Rocco turned sharply toward him, his eyes still carrying the frozen fury of a man who had just been betrayed, and said through clenched teeth that he wanted the woman thrown out of his house before the night was over. But Silvio shook his head firmly, and replied that doing so would be no different from firing a warning shot into the air and alerting the entire pack. If Rocco revealed even the slightest hint that he knew the truth, both Bianca and Julius would immediately retreat into hiding, erase every trace they had left behind, and vanish beyond his reach before he could uncover the entire network behind them. The advisor leaned forward and emphasized that, although the recording was valuable, it was still incomplete. They could hear Bianca's voice clearly, but they hadn't heard Julius speak. They had no direct evidence tying him to the conspiracy. And in a war against opponents who possessed both money and influence, an unfinished piece of evidence could easily be twisted into an accusation of slander. He instructed Rocco to preserve the original phone exactly as it was, never edit the recording, never make careless copies, and never send it through any unsecured channel, because a single reckless action could destroy its legal value completely. Rocco stood in silence beside the window, anger still churning inside his chest. But reason forced him to admit that his advisor was right, that in the world he ruled, the man who struck first out of impatience was often the first man to fall. Then the conversation turned to the port. Silvio lowered his voice as he said, the raid that afternoon couldn't have been a coincidence. The way the agents had gone directly to the most sensitive warehouses proved that someone on the inside had guided them. And these two events, Bianca's betrayal and the raid at the docks, might not be separate at all, but two branches of a single conspiracy far greater than anything they had yet imagined. He warned Rocco not to accuse anyone too quickly, not to let his anger drive him into distrusting loyal men while overlooking the true traitor, but instead to gather entry logs in silence, compare records, and examine every lead with patience until the entire picture came clearly into view. Rocco looked at the man who had stood beside him for so many years, and for the first time during that terrible evening, caught between the crossfire of betrayal and collapse, he felt a small measure of steadiness return, because he understood that to bring down those who already believed victory belonged to them, what he needed wasn't a moment of reckless fury, but the cold patience of a man willing to wait for the exact moment to strike. Throughout that night, after the entire estate had fallen asleep and Bianca had retired to her private room, believing everything was still unfolding exactly according to her plan, Rocco and Silvio remained in the study beneath the dim yellow light of the desk lamp, and it was during those quiet hours before dawn that a daring move slowly began to take shape. Silvio was the first to put the idea into words, saying that if they wanted to force Bianca and Julius to reveal the entire hand they were hiding, The most effective approach wasn't to chase them, but to make them believe they had already won, to make them believe the prey they had been stalking had finally collapsed, because a hunter only truly lowers his guard and exposes his weaknesses when he is certain the prey can no longer fight back. Rocco listened in silence, and when he understood the full logic of the trap, a cold smile briefly touched the corner of his mouth, because this was exactly the kind of strategy he had used all his life to bring down stronger opponents, allowing them to grow overconfident until they walked willingly into a snare woven by their own greed. The two men began laying out every step of the performance they called the false collapse, and the essential thing was that it had to appear so real that no one, not even those closest to Rocco, could suspect the truth. First, they would release rumors that the Fontaine Empire was standing on the edge of bankruptcy after the federal raid, that its accounts had been frozen, its partners were turning away, and the other families in the city were already preparing to tear apart whatever remained. And those rumors would be planted carefully through the very mouths Rocco knew would carry them to Bianca and Julius faster than anyone else. Next, to make the story more convincing, Rocco would publicly put the most dazzling symbols of his wealth up for sale: the vacation estate by the lake, the collection of exotic cars in the garage, the kinds of possessions that would make anyone looking in believe that only a man facing true ruin would be forced to surrender them. And news of those sales would spread through Chicago's upper circles within days. To make the collapse undeniable, Rocco and Silvio orchestrated a masterful theater of financial panic. They deliberately left a trail of bleeding ledgers for Julius's inside men to find, showing massive, unexplainable losses in the shell companies. Silvio personally visited 3 of the city's most notorious offshore bankers, wearing a carefully rehearsed mask of desperation, begging for high-interest loans that he knew would be instantly rejected. The orchestrated rejection sent shockwaves through the financial underground, painting a vivid picture of a dying king desperately grasping at straws. They even allowed a rival gang to hijack a minor shipment without any retaliation, a move that convinced the entire underworld that the Fontaine family no longer had the muscle or the funds to defend its borders. But the most difficult part, the part that required Rocco to act with his very being, was that he would have to pretend to crumble in front of Bianca's eyes. He would have to let her see a Rocco Fontaine who was exhausted, sleepless, drinking more than usual, irritable and powerless. A man slowly losing everything that had once made him frightening, because only when the leader of the pack appeared to have lost his fangs would the vultures dare to descend. Silvio stressed that this was the key to the entire plan, that the weaker and more desperate Rocco appeared, the more careless Bianca would become. And once she was convinced he had reached the end of the road, she would no longer have any reason to continue pretending to be a gentle bride. She would begin to show her true hand, accelerate every scheme she had made with Julius. And in that arrogant haste, they would inevitably leave behind the traces Rocco needed to uncover the entire network behind them, including the insider who had betrayed the port. Rocco nodded slowly, but he understood that the price of this performance would be far from small, because for it to succeed, he would have to swallow the pride of an entire lifetime, allow people he despised to look at him with pity, and watch the woman who had once lain beside him gradually strip away her mask without ever realizing that every step she took was being recorded. Before leaving as dawn drew near, Silvio placed a hand on Rocco's shoulder and gave him one final warning, that throughout this performance, no matter what happened, Rocco must never reveal that he still held control, must never strike too soon even once, because the trap would only truly close when the prey had sunk so deeply there was no path left to escape. And the man who had once ruled an entire underworld answered only with a brief sentence, saying that he had spent his whole life learning patience, and this time he would wait until every lie returned to the place where it had begun. Within only a few days, rumors of the Fontaine Empire's collapse had spread throughout Chicago's upper circles, exactly as Rocco and Silvio had calculated, and the first person to swallow every word of those rumors was none other than Bianca. She heard that the family's accounts had been frozen by the federal government, that the lakeside estate had been put up for sale, that the exotic cars in the garage were being transferred one by one into other hands, and each fragment of news brought a gleam of satisfaction to her eyes that she could scarcely conceal. because in the mind of that fiercely ambitious woman, Rocco's downfall wasn't a tragedy, but a golden opportunity opening before her. The change in the way she treated him came gradually, yet unmistakably. At first, it was only the moments when she no longer rushed toward him with open arms whenever he came home. Then came the dinners she avoided by claiming she was tired. And little by little, her words began to carry cutting hints and veiled mockery about whether a man who couldn't protect his own inheritance still deserved everything he had once promised. Rocco accepted it all with the outward appearance of a man struggling to endure. He allowed her to see him sitting motionless for hours in the study, with a glass of liquor in his hand. He let her catch him snapping at the servants, only to apologize afterward with quiet helplessness. He let her believe that the man who had once inspired fear had finally been broken by adversity. And each time Bianca witnessed one of those scenes, her contempt rose another degree. Once, in the middle of dinner and in front of several household servants, she remarked that she had been a fool to bind her life to a man who had nothing left in his hands, that she should have chosen someone who knew how to protect his fortune instead of wasting all his concern on the lowly workers at the docks. And Rocco merely lowered his head and stared at the food on his plate, allowing the insult to pass as though he no longer possessed the strength to answer, while deep inside, he was coldly committing every word to memory. At the same time that Bianca openly treated Rocco with growing disdain, she began tightening her connection with Julius Kane. The whispered phone calls lasted longer. The outings she claimed were meetings with friends became more frequent, though in truth she was meeting him. And during those secret encounters, the two conspirators no longer discussed merely taking control of the docks. They began planning beyond that, toward the day Bianca would officially become Rocco's wife and would naturally hold the legal right to inherit everything that remained of the family fortune. The thought of becoming the sole heir caused the greed inside her to grow by the day, like a fire fed with fresh oil. She began secretly researching legal provisions, studying what rights she would gain over the shell companies once the wedding was complete, and examining how control could gradually be shifted toward Julius without alerting the other members of the family council. She even began behaving as though she were already the true mistress of the estate, ordering the servants around with greater arrogance than before, changing the arrangement of the house without permission, and standing more than once in the center of the grand sitting room with the gaze of someone admiring the kingdom she was about to seize. The bitter irony was that this very sense of triumph had made Bianca completely blind to what was truly happening. She was certain she held the absolute advantage, certain that Rocco had become a wounded animal with no strength left to bite back, and in her intoxication with power, she never realized that every contemptuous word she spoke, every step she took closer to Julius, and every scheme she allowed to slip into view was being quietly observed and remembered by the man she believed had already fallen. As he waited for the day, she would confidently step all the way into the trap she didn't know was already open beneath her feet. While the hidden war among powerful people quietly intensified inside the estate, not far away, in an aging apartment building on the west side of the city, Delia Vance was fighting another battle, quieter but no less merciless. At the end of every long shift, when everyone else had gone home to rest, she hurried to catch the last bus so she could sit beside her mother's hospital bed, beside Colette Vance, the woman who had raised her alone through years of cleaning houses and sewing clothes, and who now lay there with a heart growing weaker by the day, Dr. Ellen Brandt. The middle-aged physician overseeing Colette's case sat down with Delia in the brightly lit hospital waiting room late one evening and told her the truth she had feared for so long. Her mother's heart condition had worsened faster than expected. She needed urgent surgery within the next few weeks if she was to avoid risks no one could predict. And before the hospital could schedule the operation, the family would have to provide a substantial deposit. Dr. Ellen Brandt, wearing a faded white coat that bore the weight of countless sleepless nights, looked at the young woman through her wire-rimmed glasses with a mixture of professional gravity and deep compassion. She had known the Vance family for years, watching Delia exhaust herself to keep her mother alive, and it pained her to be the bearer of such cold, calculated financial realities. Dr. Brandt gently placed her hand over Delia's cold fingers, her voice dropping to a soft murmur as she explained that the medical board's hands were tied. and without that specific deposit, the surgical team could not legally be mobilized. When Dr. Brandt wrote the amount on a sheet of paper and slid it across the table, Delia had to clench both hands beneath the table to keep them from trembling. She sat there in silence for a long time, staring at the figures as though they might somehow grow smaller if she looked at them long enough, because she knew there wasn't even a fraction of that amount in her meager savings account, and every paycheck she received was divided into so many pieces that nothing remained before it could even be called savings. There was rent for the cramped apartment, electricity and water, her mother's monthly medication, and tuition for the evening forensic accounting classes she had forced herself to continue taking in the hope that one day she might escape a lifetime of servitude. Everything she earned was consumed before it ever had the chance to accumulate. And now, faced with that enormous sum, Delia felt for the first time as though the weight of the entire world were pressing down upon her narrow shoulders. Dr. Brandt looked at her with sympathy and gently told her to take time to think, promising that the hospital would do everything it could to help. But both women understood that such words of comfort couldn't bridge the distance between the money Delia had and the money she needed. That night, when she entered the hospital room, Delia immediately swallowed every trace of panic and greeted her mother with a warm smile, because she never allowed Colette to see her despair. And when the frail woman took her hand and whispered that she was sorry for becoming a burden, that she was willing to refuse the surgery so her daughter wouldn't have to suffer because of her, Delia had to turn away and pretend to adjust the pillow in order to hide the tears filling her eyes. Then she tightened her grip around her mother's thin hand and spoke in the strongest voice she could gather, telling her never to say such things again, asking who she would have left in this world if her mother were gone, promising that she would find a way and that all her mother had to do was keep fighting to recover. Late that night, when Delia returned to the silent apartment, instead of collapsing onto the bed from exhaustion, she quietly sat down at the small table beneath the study lamp, opened her forensic accounting textbook, and tried to force numbers and principles into her weary mind because for her, those studies weren't merely a dream of changing her life. They were the only lifeline keeping her from sinking completely beneath the sea of worry. She studied how to trace hidden flows of money, how to detect falsified figures, how one carefully documented piece of evidence could expose an entire web of lies. And as her hand moved tirelessly across the page, filling line after line with notes, only one simple and fierce thought remained in her mind. She had to stay strong. She had to stay clear-headed. She had to survive this period at any cost, because somewhere in that hospital room, the fragile heart of the mother she loved more than anyone was waiting, day by day, for her to find a way out. Of everything Delia had learned in her evening forensic accounting classes, one piece of advice from her elderly instructor had lodged itself more deeply in her mind than anything else. That when someone with power threatens your livelihood or your life, the only weapon available to the powerless is evidence, and the most trustworthy evidence is a careful written record of dates, exact words, and the people who were present. Because human memory becomes fragile and easily distorted when fear enters the picture. It was because of that advice that, several weeks earlier, after Bianca first began making veiled threats about throwing her into the street, Delia had quietly started a habit no one in the estate knew about. She bought a plain gray-covered notebook, the inexpensive kind sold at the corner store, and every night after finishing her shift, she sat down and recorded in meticulous detail everything that had happened that day. She wrote down every insult and every threat, noting the exact time each incident occurred and the names of everyone who had been in the room, even including details that might have seemed trivial, such as the color of the dress Bianca had been wearing, or the object she had held in her hand, because Delia understood that in a world where the word of a wealthy woman would always carry more weight than the word of a poor maid, only details precise enough to feel cold could protect her if the day ever came when she was forced to prove her innocence. That gray notebook became Delia's silent companion. She hid it carefully at the bottom of the worn handbag she carried everywhere, and every line of small, orderly handwriting inside it was another piece of the truth she patiently gathered through days filled with humiliation. Then, late one afternoon, while Delia was cleaning the corridor near the small parlor, She accidentally overheard a fragment of conversation that seemed to turn her blood cold. Bianca's voice drifted through the partially open door, but this time it wasn't filled with the contempt Delia knew so well. It was a low, calculating exchange, and although Delia heard only a few broken sentences before hurrying away to avoid being discovered, what reached her ears was enough to make her shudder. She heard Bianca mention the need to take care of something involving Rocco, refer to a man whose name Delia didn't recognize, and speak of Delia herself as an obstacle that needed to be removed before the wedding. Delia didn't hear the entire conversation. She didn't know how far the conspiracy reached or who else stood behind it, and she didn't dare remain there for even another second to listen more closely. But the instinct of a woman who had spent too long being treated as though she were beneath everyone else told her that what she had just heard wasn't something she could simply ignore. That night, when she returned to the apartment, Delia's hands trembled as she opened the gray notebook, and for one brief moment she hesitated. A voice in her mind warned her that writing down something like this could draw her into danger, that if the notebook ever fell into the wrong hands, it might become the very thing that made her pay the price. But then she thought of her mother lying in a hospital bed, thought of the unjust world where the weak were always forced into silence, and understood that fear couldn't become a reason to close her eyes and look away, because silence had never protected people like her. So she drew a deep breath, picked up her pen, and with handwriting that still trembled slightly, carefully recorded everything she had heard, the date and time, the position of the door, and every fragment of every sentence she could remember, never imagining that those small lines, written in fear, would one day become one of the most important pieces needed to overturn an entire game that powerful people believed they had already won. Bianca wasn't the kind of person who would allow a potential threat like Delia to continue existing in peace. And as she grew increasingly convinced that Rocco had lost all power to protect anyone, she began carrying out an attack far more calculated and vicious than the direct insults she had used before. She set out to destroy the young woman's reputation from the shadows. It began with whispers released with careful precision. Bianca started hinting to people in Chicago's upper circles that several valuable items had recently disappeared from the Fontaine estate. Then she would frown as though deeply troubled and say she didn't want to accuse anyone. But it was difficult not to feel suspicious when the impoverished maid was the only person who regularly entered the rooms where expensive possessions were kept. Once planted, those rumors spread like flames caught by the wind, and within only a few days, the claim that Delia was a thief had passed from one mouth to another, becoming more distorted and swollen with every retelling, until it was no longer a vague suspicion, but an unquestioned truth in the eyes of people who had never once spoken to her. More cruelly still, Bianca had someone retrieve old photographs taken at family gatherings, photographs in which Delia had merely appeared by accident in the background wearing her servant's uniform, then cropped and altered them so that the young woman became the focus, framed in suggestive angles. And those manipulated images were posted across social media with bitter captions implying greed and betrayal, accusing a woman who had supposedly been fed, sheltered, and educated properly of turning around and stealing from the very people who had taken her in. The digital assault was suffocating and relentless. Fake social media accounts, undoubtedly funded by Bianca's limitless allowance, dissected Delia's life with terrifying precision. They mocked her worn-out shoes, posted her neighborhood's crime rates to brand her as street trash, and flooded local community forums with fabricated warnings about her character. Every time Delia looked at her cracked phone screen, she saw thousands of strangers enthusiastically participating in her public execution. The sheer scale of the coordinated hatred made her feel as though the walls of the city were physically closing in on her, a chilling reminder of how effortlessly the wealthy could manipulate reality and destroy a powerless citizen's life from the comfort of their velvet couches. The consequences descended on Delia swiftly and without mercy. One morning, while she was on her way to the hospital to visit her mother, she received a call from the Human Resources Department of that same hospital, where she had applied for a part-time position in the hope of earning additional money for the surgery. And the person on the other end informed her coldly that her application process had been suspended indefinitely for a background review. though both sides silently understood the real reason. Delia stood frozen on the crowded sidewalk, the phone still pressed to her ear even after the call had ended, and she felt as though the ground had been pulled out from beneath her feet, because that job had been the lifeline she had clung to for days, and now it had vanished because of an accusation she hadn't even been given the right to answer. Isolation began closing around her from every direction. Coworkers at the estate, who had once greeted her with a few friendly words, now avoided her eyes, whispered behind her back, and fell silent whenever she approached. Because in a world where power belonged to the strong, very few people dared stand beside a maid targeted by the woman expected to become the future mistress of the house. Even those who had once felt some sympathy for her chose to keep their distance in order to protect themselves, and Delia understood. She didn't blame them, because she knew that in their position, she might not have been able to act differently either. What hurt her most wasn't the rumors or the shunning looks, but the helplessness of watching her honor trampled while having no way to defend it, of realizing that a person with enough wealth and influence could easily turn an honest human being into a criminal in everyone's eyes, with nothing more than a few words and several false photographs. Yet even in those darkest hours, when she returned to the silent apartment and sat curled in the shadows, Delia still quietly took out the gray notebook and recorded everything. She wrote down the call from the hospital, the rumors she had heard, and every date connected to the campaign of slander that was drowning her life. Because deep inside a heart hardened by pain, she still protected one stubborn belief, that no matter how deeply the truth was buried, the day would eventually come when it rose into the light. Rocco had been quietly watching Delia ever since the day he witnessed her humiliation in the dining room. But it wasn't until Bianca's campaign of slander against her reached its height that he finally decided to approach the young woman, because, in the mind of a man accustomed to seeing through every hidden motive, a conviction had gradually begun to form that the maid shunned by the entire estate might be the only person in the house who had never lied to him. He chose a late evening when Bianca had gone out and the other servants had already left, quietly seeking Delia in the rear kitchen, where she was alone finishing the last of her cleaning before going home. And when his tall figure appeared in the doorway, the young woman startled and stepped back, her eyes revealing the wariness of someone who had grown far too accustomed to being hurt by powerful people. Rocco kept his distance, his voice low and calm, and told her that he knew the rumors about her were lies, that he didn't believe she was a thief. And those words, instead of bringing Delia relief, only made her more cautious, because she had learned that unexpected kindness from those standing above her could sometimes be even more dangerous than open cruelty. She didn't rush to show gratitude or lower her head in thanks. She merely asked in a quiet voice, "What do you want from me?" And the bluntness of the question caught Rocco briefly off guard, because it had been a very long time since anyone had dared look directly into his eyes without fear or flattery. During that guarded conversation, filled with tense silences, Rocco carefully asked about what she might have witnessed inside the estate. At first, Delia answered only in short, restrained phrases. But when he mentioned that he knew Bianca was trying to harm her, something inside her seemed to break open, and she slowly admitted that she had written everything down. Rocco went still when she reached into the bottom of her worn handbag and drew out the gray-covered notebook, and as he turned through pages crowded with small, orderly handwriting, recording every date, every threat, and every detail that an ordinary person would never have thought to preserve, he immediately understood that what he held wasn't merely the private journal of a humiliated maid. It was a documented timeline of evidence created before the conspiracy had fully erupted, something of immeasurable value in the game he was playing. He lifted his eyes and looked at the young woman differently then. There was no longer pity for someone powerless, but respect for a person who had armed herself with the only weapon her circumstances allowed. And in that moment, he understood that Delia was the crucial witness he needed, the only person capable of connecting the fragments that even he, with all his power, had not yet managed to gather completely. But when Rocco asked to borrow the notebook and offered to protect her, Delia stepped back and set her boundaries in a voice that was calm but unyielding. She said that she was only an employee in this house, that if she made accusations against the woman he was preparing to marry, What assurance did she have that he wouldn't turn around and decide that she was the one causing trouble? And the question struck directly at the most painful truth, leaving Rocco unable to answer at once, because he knew she was right. She added that she had recorded everything, not because she wanted to become a pawn in a war between powerful people, but because she needed to protect herself and the mother lying in a hospital bed, and that she wouldn't place her safety in anyone's hands merely because they offered her an empty promise. Rocco stood in silence and looked at the slender woman before him, and for the first time in many years, he felt a respect mingled with something he couldn't yet name beginning to move through him, a tense and wounded emotion taking its first fragile shape between two people who came from entirely different worlds, and he understood that if he wanted this woman's trust, he would have to earn it through action, not through power or money, the tools he had relied upon all his life to obtain everything he desired. After meeting with Delia, Rocco returned to his study and sat for a long time in the darkness, with only the streetlights filtering through the window and casting their pale glow across his contemplative face. Because the question the young woman had thrown at him, whether he might eventually turn around and blame her instead, continued to haunt him without mercy. He realized that Delia's caution wasn't groundless timidity, but the result of a bitter truth he had never dared face in all his life, that in the world he had spent so many years building and ruling, no one dared tell him the things he didn't want to hear. For years, Rocco had taken pride in believing he was a different kind of boss, that he paid his employees generously, that he never allowed the people who worked for him to go without, that he possessed principles of honor many others in his world lacked. But now, beneath the cold light of truth, he was forced to admit that his generosity had concealed a deadly blind spot within him. He had confused providing money with genuinely caring about human beings. He had believed that paying wages fully and on time was enough to fulfill his duty as a decent employer, never realizing that beneath his own roof, an honest woman like Delia had been forced to endure cruelty and humiliation in silence, day after day, while he remained comfortably proud of his own benevolence. What tormented him most wasn't Bianca's cruelty, because her cruelty was something he knew how to confront, but the realization that he himself had created a world where his power had become so great that everyone around him lived in fear, and that fear had raised an invisible wall between him and the truth. Delia had seen Bianca getting into Julius's car weeks earlier. She had known something was wrong, yet she had chosen to remain silent, and the reason for her silence wasn't cowardice. It was because she understood that in the eyes of a powerful man like him, the word of a poor maid would never carry as much weight as the word of the woman he intended to marry. That if she spoke, she would be the one suspected of stirring up trouble, not Bianca. The thought sent a chill down Rocco's spine, because it meant that over all those years, countless other truths might also have been buried in silence, simply because the people who knew them were too afraid to speak. How many warnings had never reached him? How many signs of danger that he should known about had failed to reach his ears because he had unknowingly turned himself into a man no one dared be honest with? The price of that blind spot now stood before him with unbearable clarity. He had nearly married a traitor. His empire had been stabbed in the back by someone from within. He had stood on the edge of ruin without realizing it until the final moment. Rocco rose and walked to the window, looking down at the silent street shining beneath the rain. And inside the heart of a man who had once believed he understood every hidden corner of power, a quiet but unwavering decision began to form. He would protect Delia, not because she was useful to the game he was playing, but because it was the right thing to do, something he should have done long ago. Yet he understood that in his world, protection couldn't come through promises or ordinary legal procedures. It had to come in his own way, through the unseen power he controlled. And so he quietly ordered the most loyal men in his circle to watch over the young woman and her mother in the hospital, guarding them from a distance without allowing Delia to know, because he didn't want that protection to become a burden or a chain that made her feel indebted to him. In that moment, for the first time in many years, Rocco Fontaine no longer thought like a boss calculating his next move, but like a human being trying to atone for a wrong he hadn't even known he had committed, and that late awakening had begun to change him quietly in ways even he couldn't yet foresee. The performance of a false collapse had worked exactly as Silvio predicted. But when reports from the men watching in secret revealed that Bianca and Julius were no longer content to wait for Rocco to wither away on his own, and had begun discussing a far more decisive and ruthless move, the old advisor understood that the game had entered a stage more dangerous than any before it. During a private meeting late at night in the study, Silvio placed before Rocco everything he had just learned. The two conspirators were now convinced that as long as Rocco remained alive, every plan to seize his empire would still carry risk, because even a wounded wolf could recover and strike back. And for that reason, they had decided that the surest way for Bianca to inherit everything the family had left was for her to become a widow before she ever had the chance to become a wife. Rocco listened without any change in his expression, because deep inside, he had already understood that once greed crossed a certain boundary, it would never willingly stop. Yet hearing that the very woman who had once lain beside him was prepared to send him to his death still sent a cold current down his spine. It was from that mortal danger that an idea so daring it bordered on recklessness began to take shape in Silvio's mind. Instead of trying to prevent the conspiracy, they would transform it into the final and most perfect trap of all, by allowing Bianca and Julius to believe they had succeeded, to believe that Rocco Fontaine had truly been removed from the game forever. The plan was drawn with the cold precision of men who had spent their lives in a world where every mistake carried a terrible price. Silvio would carefully allow certain pieces of information to slip out, guiding the two conspirators into believing they had an opportunity to strike. And when the moment came, everything would be arranged so that from every outside angle, it would appear that their plan had achieved its purpose, that the once powerful boss had fallen and no longer walked among the living. Rocco's most loyal men whose devotion had been tested through years of hardship, and had never wavered even when the empire seemed to be collapsing, would be called upon to create a performance without a flaw, with rumors planted in the right places, traces arranged exactly as needed, and Rocco's sudden disappearance made convincing enough for the entire underworld to believe that the worst had truly happened. Silvio emphasized that this would be the greatest and most dangerous gamble in the entire plan, because once it began, there would be no way to take it back. And throughout the time when the whole world believed he was dead, Rocco would have to vanish completely from sight, remain hidden in the darkness, and restrain every instinct that urged him to intervene, even if he had to watch the traitors celebrate freely over the collapse they believed was real. Yet that very absence, that certainty that their prey was truly dead, would cause Bianca and Julius to abandon the last of their caution. It would make them expose openly everything they had kept hidden, step confidently into the light to enjoy their victory, and never realize that every word, every action, and every moment of triumph was being preserved as evidence. Rocco sat in silence for a long time, weighing the price and the danger of such a move, because he understood that faking his death wasn't merely a deception. It meant giving his enemies the feeling that they had won completely, and the moment when they felt safest would also be the moment when they were most vulnerable. At last, he raised his head and looked at the old advisor, who had stood beside him through so many storms, and in a voice so calm it carried a chill, he said to let them believe they had won, let them celebrate as loudly as they wished, because the higher they climbed in their certainty of victory, the more painful their fall would be. And when he stepped out of the grave they had prepared for him, that would be the moment when every lie returned at once to collect its debt. The execution of the false assassination required a flawless performance from Rocco's inner circle, transforming a regular Tuesday evening into a ghost story that all of Chicago would swallow. Silvio coordinated the chess pieces with absolute discretion, ensuring that no actual blood was spilled, yet leaving behind a trail of whispers, a suddenly abandoned vehicle near the river docks, and an eerie, absolute silence from the Fontaine estate that spoke louder than any public announcement. Rocco himself retreated into the deep shadows of a secure, unindexed safe house, deliberately cut off from the world, trusting that the calculated vacuum left by his sudden disappearance would act as the ultimate bait for the vultures circling his crown. Behind that eerie silence at the river docks lay a calculated trap that turned Bianca and Julius's own deadly ambition against them. The hitman they had paid handsomely to eliminate Rocco had no idea that his every move had been tracked by Silvio's network from the moment he accepted the contract. On that fateful Tuesday evening, As the assassin waited in the shadows near the deserted pier, he found himself surrounded not by an unsuspecting target, but by Rocco's most elite, heavily armed loyalists who disarmed him before he could even reach for his weapon. Faced with the chilling choice between immediate erasure or a massive payoff from the Fontaine Empire to play his part, the mercenary wisely chose survival. He delivered the blood-stained personal effects Rocco handed him straight back to Julius as proof of a successful hit, while Rocco's men precision-staged the abandoned, bullet-riddled vehicle by the water. It was a masterclass in counter-espionage, ensuring that the heavy silence hanging over the city wasn't the result of a successful murder, but the quiet holding of a breath before the real trap snapped shut. When news of Rocco's disappearance reached Bianca, accompanied by carefully arranged signs that convinced her the man had left the game forever, her first reaction wasn't grief, but a surge of triumph that rose so sharply it nearly caught in her throat, a feeling of relief mingled with elation that she struggled to conceal beneath the outward appearance of a woman mourning the man she had expected to marry. Within the four walls of her private room, when she was finally alone, Bianca stood before the large mirror and studied her reflection for a long time, her lips curving into a smile she no longer bothered to suppress, because only one thought now consumed her mind, that everything she had ever desired was finally within reach. She called Julius in a whisper trembling with excitement, and the two conspirators congratulated each other on a plan they believed had been carried out perfectly. Bianca immediately began behaving like someone who had officially become the absolute mistress of the entire estate. She summoned the asset managers and began asking about the procedures required to take control of everything the family still possessed in her position as Rocco's lawful fiancée. She moved through the mansion with the bearing of a newly crowned queen, touching such expensive object as though asserting her ownership, and issuing commands to the servants in a superior tone, no longer softened by even the slightest trace of restraint. But nothing revealed Bianca's greed and cruelty more clearly than her decision to organize a grand gathering, an event she publicly described as a memorial and tribute, though in her heart it was truly a celebration of her own victory, a night when she would display before all of Chicago's upper class that she had risen to the summit of power and now held everything in her hands. She personally prepared a guest list containing the names of the city's 200 most prominent figures, chose the grand ballroom of its most luxurious hotel, ordered costly floral arrangements and bottles of rare wine, and selected a magnificent gown for herself, as though this were the most important day of her life, because to Bianca, standing beneath brilliant lights while surrounded by the admiration and envy of everyone present was the sweetest reward for all the months she had been forced to play the role of a gentle and devoted bride. Yet even at the height of her triumph, the cruelty inside her wouldn't allow her to ignore the thorn that had remained lodged in her side for so long. That thorn was Delia, the maid she both despised and feared, the woman who had witnessed her secret with her own eyes, and the only person Bianca hadn't yet managed to eliminate completely. Bianca decided that her victory celebration would also be the place where she destroyed Delia once and for all, not through a quiet dismissal, but through a public humiliation powerful enough to stain the young woman's name forever and ensure that no one would ever believe another word she said. To accomplish that, Bianca needed false evidence, an excuse that couldn't be denied, and so one afternoon, when the servants' quarters were deserted, she personally went to the row of employee lockers, carrying the expensive diamond ring she intended to claim had been stolen. With the confidence of someone who believed she now possessed the power to decide everyone's fate, she opened the locker bearing Delia's name and quietly pushed the ring deep inside, hiding it beneath a neatly folded uniform. Her carefully manicured hands didn't tremble as she committed that despicable act, because in her mind, it was merely one final move required to remove an insignificant obstacle. What Bianca didn't know, what her arrogance and blind certainty of victory had made her incapable of imagining, was that directly above her, concealed in a hidden corner invisible to the naked eye, a small camera had silently captured every second of what she had done. From the moment she opened the locker door to the instant, she carefully closed it again and walked away with a satisfied smile on her lips. The man she believed was dead remained somewhere in the darkness, quietly watching her every move through the eyes of those loyal to him. And every triumphant action, every cruel scheme Bianca carried out in the belief that no one remained who could stop her, was in truth another strand she was weaving with her own hands into the noose that would tighten around her on the fateful night she believed would become the most glorious night of victory in her life. A few days before the gathering, Delia unexpectedly received an order from Bianca requiring her to be present and serve during that important evening. And the moment she heard the news, a feeling of unease rose inside her, like a dark cloud warning of an approaching storm. She couldn't understand why someone who hated her, and had done everything possible to harm her, would suddenly want her to appear at such a crowded event, and that very lack of reason only strengthened her belief that behind the summons lay a scheme she couldn't yet identify. Delia had endured enough to understand that when someone powerful deliberately pulls you into the spotlight, it is rarely for anything good, and that night she sat for a long time at the small table in her apartment, turning through the pages of her gray notebook, rereading every line she had written about Bianca's threats, while the feeling that a trap was being prepared for her grew clearer with every passing moment. She thought of her mother lying in the hospital, thought of the surgery still hanging in uncertainty because they lacked the money, and understood that no matter how terrible her instincts felt, she had no choice but to go, because refusing the future mistress's order would mean losing the last job she had left. While Delia lay awake with her growing fear, in another secluded place hidden within the darkness of the city, Rocco and Silvio were entering the final and most important stage of the entire plan, assembling every piece of evidence into a chain that couldn't be broken, spread across a long table. Before the two men were the fragments they had patiently collected over many weeks. The original recording Rocco had secretly captured through the partition, the video from the hidden camera showing Bianca personally placing the ring inside Delia's locker, and beside them, copies of the entry logs from both the estate and the port, documents recording the precise moment each door had opened, every access card that had been used, and every trace carelessly left behind by people who believed themselves too clever to be caught. Silvio slowly compared each point in the timeline, matching what Delia had written in her gray notebook with the cold electronic records. And little by little, the full picture of the conspiracy emerged with increasing clarity, revealing that Bianca and Julius had gone far beyond deception and betrayal and had reached the point of discussing the hiring of someone to take Rocco's life and clear the way for the inheritance. The evidence of their murderous intent was the most powerful piece of all, something that, once exposed, wouldn't merely destroy their reputations, but would be enough to place both conspirators within reach of federal prosecution. And Silvio knew this would become the final blow in the reversal they were preparing. Yet even as the evidence of Bianca's betrayal neared completion, one question continued to trouble Silvio: the identity of the insider who had betrayed the port to the federal authorities, the person who had guided the raid and sent two innocent lieutenants to jail, because every trail he followed seemed to lead toward a dark truth buried deep inside the family's most trusted circle, a truth that made even an experienced advisor like him uneasy. He told Rocco that every clue pointed toward someone very close, someone they had both trusted, but he refused to speak the name until he held the final piece of proof in his hands, because in their world, falsely accusing a loyal person could be just as dangerous as allowing a traitor to escape. Rocco listened as his eyes darkened, because the thought that the person who had stabbed him in the back might be one of the people to whom he had given his complete trust twisted painfully inside him. But he pushed the feeling aside and focused on the decisive night ahead. The two men agreed on every final detail of the plan, from the moment Rocco would appear to the exact order in which the evidence would be revealed. And when the lights in the hidden room finally went dark near dawn, both Rocco and Silvio understood that the gathering Bianca was eagerly preparing as the night of her greatest triumph would in truth become the stage for the most spectacular collapse of all, a place where every lie, every cruel scheme, and every act of betrayal would finally be dragged into the light before 200 witnesses, and the storm that had been gathering for 41 days was now waiting for only one precise moment to break. In the magnificent ballroom, where 200 guests had fixed their eyes upon her, Bianca still held a fistful of Delia's hair tightly in her hand, and the young woman's stubborn silence, the way she kept her head raised instead of begging, only caused the fury and triumph inside Bianca to blaze even more violently. She hissed that this girl had dared steal her priceless diamond ring, that this was the true face of poor, lowborn people who were given shelter only to turn around and bite the hand that had taken them in. And she ordered Delia to kneel and confess her guilt in front of everyone, so there would be no room left for denial. But instead of collapsing in fear as Bianca expected, Delia slowly looked around the ballroom at the faces, waiting to witness the downfall of someone they considered beneath them. Then, in a voice that trembled yet remained clear enough for the entire room to hear, she answered that if Bianca wanted to accuse her, then she should do it properly. She said that before anyone touched the ring being presented as evidence, they should clearly record who had opened the locker, who had first discovered it, who possessed a key, and who had permission to enter that area, because an accusation was nothing more than slander, unless it was accompanied by an investigation into where the evidence had come from and who had been given the opportunity to place it there. She said poor people also had the right to a fair investigation, that she wasn't asking anyone for pity, but only demanding that the truth be revealed exactly as it was. And those words, spoken by a maid whose hair was being pulled while she was forced toward the floor, caused the entire ballroom to fall suddenly silent, in a confusion no one could quite explain, because no one had expected a person driven to the edge to retain such clarity and dignity. Bianca froze for a moment, a flash of unease crossing her face, but her arrogance immediately overwhelmed it. She gave a scornful laugh, snatched the microphone from the host's hand, and ground out each word into it, saying that she didn't need any investigation, that she knew with her own eyes that this girl was a thief. And she shouted the accusation loudly enough for all 200 people to hear, certain she had just delivered the final blow. But at the very moment, her voice had not yet fully faded from the air. Every brilliant light in the ballroom suddenly went dark. The room plunged into abrupt blackness, sending startled murmurs rippling through the crowd. And then the enormous screen behind Bianca flared to life, displaying a video before everyone with every detail unmistakably clear. On that screen, under the gaze of 200 pairs of eyes, Bianca herself appeared, wearing clothes and carrying herself in a manner that couldn't possibly be mistaken, quietly opening the locker bearing Delia's name, taking the diamond ring from her clothing, carefully hiding it beneath the neatly folded uniform, then closing the door with a satisfied smile on her lips. The entire ballroom seemed to stop breathing. Gasps of disbelief and stunned whispers spread through the room like waves, and Bianca's hand, still gripping Delia's hair, suddenly fell away. Her face changed from triumph to deathly pale in an instant as she realized that the evidence being exposed before everyone wasn't against the maid at all, but against her. Delia slowly rose from the floor and lifted a hand to smooth her disheveled hair. And although her entire body was still trembling, her eyes now held the calm of someone whose innocence had just been restored by the truth, while throughout the ballroom, the gazes that had moments earlier been filled with contempt for her turned together toward Bianca with horror and disgust. Bianca stammered in search of a denial, her lips forming meaningless claims that the video was false, that someone was trying to destroy her. But her voice broke, and no one cared to believe her anymore, because the images on the screen were far too clear to deny. And while Bianca floundered in the collapse of her first lie, while she believed everything had already become as terrible as it could possibly be, the great doors of the ballroom slowly opened, and from the light spilling in from the corridor, a tall, familiar figure she had been certain had vanished from this world forever, began walking slowly inside, causing her knees to nearly give way beneath her where she stood. Rocco Fontaine entered the center of the ballroom with slow, measured steps, alive and unharmed, his ice-cold gaze cutting straight through the stunned crowd before settling on the bloodless face of the woman who had once believed she had buried him. And with every step he took toward her, Bianca retreated as though she were watching a ghost return from the grave. She stammered his name, her voice breaking into sounds that carried no clear meaning, because the entire foundation of her certainty that she had won had collapsed in a single instant. And when Rocco began to speak, his voice was calm and low, yet it carried throughout the deathly silent ballroom. He said that the video they had just watched was only the first truth, and that there was a second truth, far heavier than the first, which everyone present that night deserved to know. He gave a slight signal, and the enormous screen came alive once again. But this time it didn't show the ring being planted in the locker. Instead, recordings and documents appeared, exposing a conspiracy many times darker. Evidence proving that Bianca and Julius Kane had joined forces not only to seize the Fontaine Empire, but also to hire someone to take Rocco's life, arranging his death so she could lawfully inherit the entire fortune as his widow. Julius's voice rang clearly through the speakers, coldly discussing when the act should be carried out, the amount of money that had been promised, and the method they would use to conceal every trace. And each sentence struck the ballroom like the blow of a hammer, leaving the wealthy guests, people accustomed to polished social performances, pale before the naked cruelty unfolding in front of them. Julius, who had been standing among the crowd believing he was safe in the shadows, suddenly became the focus of every horrified gaze, his face twisting with panic as he realized that the secret conversations he had been certain no one knew about had been recorded in full. He stumbled backward toward the door, but Rocco's men had already sealed every exit in silence. Yet the heaviest blow, the revelation that no one in the ballroom, not even Bianca or Julius themselves, could have anticipated, had still not been delivered, because as Rocco continued, he turned his gaze toward a man standing in the front row among the guests. Someone everyone knew as one of the Fontaine family's most trusted and highly regarded lieutenants, a man who had stood beside Rocco for years and had always appeared absolutely loyal. Rocco slowly revealed that this man was the insider who had betrayed the port to the federal authorities, that he was the one who had leaked the information that led to the raid, forged the false documents used to frame 2 innocent lieutenants, and sent them to prison in his place, and that he had done all of it not because of principle or coercion, but because Julius Kane had bought him with money and the promise of a powerful position in the new empire once Rocco had been removed. This was a man who had broken bread at Rocco's own dining table, a man who had kissed the cheeks of Rocco's elderly mother years ago and sworn an oath of blood and absolute loyalty to the Fontaine name. The sheer audacity of his treason sent a palpable, chilling shockwave through the room. While Bianca's betrayal was born of greed and Julius's of ambition, this lieutenant's betrayal was a profound violation of the sacred brotherhood that held their dangerous world together. A collective murmur of absolute disgust rippled through the assembled mafia bosses and syndicate heads. To them, an enemy who shoots at you from the front is a rival to be respected, but a brother who sells the keys to the fortress from the inside is a parasite that deserves no mercy. That truth suddenly joined the 2 conspiracies that had once appeared separate into a single network, because everyone now understood that Bianca's personal betrayal and the treachery at the port were merely 2 arms of the same monster, both serving Julius's ambition to seize everything, after he had skillfully cast his net from several directions in order to strangle Rocco all at once. The traitorous lieutenant turned pale and tried to claim he was being framed, but Silvio stepped forward from behind Rocco with files in his hands and coldly displayed the bank transfers, secret calls, and undeniable evidence connecting him to Julius, and beneath the weight of the truth, every denial dissolved into meaninglessness. Bianca stood rooted to the center of the ballroom, watching every layer of lies she and her conspirators had spent so long weaving being stripped away piece by piece before 200 witnesses. And there was no triumph left in her eyes now, only the terror of someone who had just realized that the trap she had prepared to destroy another person had turned back and tightened around her own throat. Rocco stood at the center of it all, calmly watching the 3 traitors collapse one after another, and in the heavy silence that covered the ballroom, everyone understood that the man they had believed was dead was not only alive, but had just overturned the entire game at the very moment his enemies had felt certain they had won everything. Among the 200 guests gathered in the ballroom that night, not everyone was merely a curious spectator, for scattered throughout the crowd were the commanding faces of powerful families and the most influential figures in the city's underworld. People whose judgment carried more weight than any courtroom verdict. And it was before those very witnesses that Rocco's revelation took on a meaning far greater than simply exposing criminals. In the world where Rocco and men like him existed, the gravest sin wasn't greed or cruelty, but the betrayal of trust, and the fact that Bianca and Julius had dared plot the death of a boss, that a lieutenant had dared sell out the very family that had sheltered and elevated him, were crimes the entire underworld considered beyond forgiveness. When the final pieces of evidence were presented and not a single opening remained for denial, the other bosses in the ballroom turned their eyes toward the three traitors with cold contempt. And in that instant, their fate was decided, not through any loud declaration of judgment, but through a silent and absolute agreement. Julius Cain, who had spent so long casting his net from several directions in the hope of swallowing the Fontaine Empire whole, now stood exposed as a gambler who had wagered everything and lost it all. Every connection he had built in the financial world and the underworld turned away from him at once, because no one wanted to be associated with a man revealed as part of a murder conspiracy, a man who had now become a target of both the federal government and the powerful forces he had betrayed. Rocco's people had prepared for this moment, and the complete files containing evidence of the murder plot, money laundering, and falsified documents were quietly transferred to federal authorities through lawful channels that couldn't be traced back, ensuring that the very legal system Julius had once believed he could manipulate would now crush him. And the bitterest irony of all was that the raid on the port, which he and the insider had orchestrated to destroy Rocco, ultimately became the trail that led federal agents directly to his own door. The traitorous lieutenant, who had traded years of trust for dirty money and an empty promise, faced the most bitter fate a man in his world could imagine. He was stripped of every honor and position, permanently cast out from the community to which he had once belonged, and handed over to the law with complete evidence of his crimes, while the two innocent lieutenants he had sent to prison were cleared and released because of the very records Rocco and Silvio had patiently gathered. As for Bianca, the woman who had once stood in the center of that ballroom, believing the world itself lay in her hands, she was now forced to watch everything she had desired vanish before her eyes. The power she thought she had seized, the status she had dreamed of, the admiration she had craved, all of it turned into disgust and contempt in the eyes of the very people she had once wanted to impress. She wasn't beaten or humiliated through violence, because Rocco understood that for someone like Bianca, the cruelest punishment wasn't physical pain, but being forced to live while watching everything she had built through deception collapse into ashes, becoming an outcast, rejected by both high society and the underworld, facing serious legal charges for her role in the murder conspiracy, and carrying that disgrace through the remainder of her life. As the traitors were led from the ballroom one by one, beneath the silent judgment of everyone present, Rocco stood upright in the center of the room. And in that moment, without needing to make a single declaration, everyone understood that he had reclaimed everything that had nearly been taken from him, not only his empire, his fortune, and his power, but something more valuable than all of them, the truth and his honor. The Fontaine Empire, which everyone had believed had collapsed, had never truly wavered at all, because that downfall had only been a perfectly constructed trap. And now that every piece had returned to its proper place, Rocco once again stood at the summit of the world he ruled. But this time, in the eyes of the man who had endured betrayal and returned from a grave built from lies, something had changed forever. After that fateful night when the truth finally prevailed, Delia's life gradually opened onto a new chapter, not through some dazzling miracle, but through the same perseverance and dignity she had protected during her darkest days. Her honor was fully restored when the video and the entire truth were revealed before 200 witnesses. The cruel rumors that had once surrounded her disappeared, and the people who had avoided her now looked at her with respect and a measure of remorse for having been so quick to believe a lie. What brought her greater happiness than anything else was that her mother Colette's heart surgery was finally performed in time and ended in complete success, because the cost that had once seemed like an impossible burden was quietly and discreetly taken care of. And when Delia sat beside the hospital bed, holding the warm hand of her recovering mother, the tears streaming down her cheeks were no longer tears of despair, but tears of profound gratitude for life. Yet the most admirable thing about Delia was the path she chose for herself afterward, because she refused to let her story become an easy tale about a poor maid whose fate was transformed when a powerful boss married her. When Rocco offered to repay her generously, Delia declined the extravagant gifts and accepted only the support necessary to complete the forensic accounting program she had pursued for so long. And even then, She insisted that the assistance be provided through an independent scholarship fund, where she would be evaluated fairly on the strength of her own abilities, rather than through anyone's pity or special favor. She graduated with outstanding results and became an auditing specialist, someone who used her knowledge of numbers and transparency to protect vulnerable people from exploitation, turning the weapon that had once helped her defend herself into a tool for helping others. And on her desk, she always kept a small written reminder that an ordinary person's innocence should have been enough for them to receive respect. As for Rocco, the man who had once believed he understood every corner of power was genuinely changed by everything that had happened. He spent more time questioning himself and acknowledged that the tragedy had exposed not only the cruelty of others, but also his own blind spot, the blind spot that had caused him to confuse financial provision with genuine respect for human beings. And he began rebuilding his empire in a different way, creating a place where employees were heard, treated with kindness, and no longer forced to live in fear of speaking out against injustice. Between Rocco and Delia, a special affection began to grow, but it wasn't a hurried or convenient romance. It was a deep appreciation built upon trust and mutual respect between two people who had once stood in entirely different worlds, a relationship with clear boundaries, nurtured slowly and sincerely, where Delia always preserved her independence and dignity, and never became merely the shadow of the powerful man beside her. The story of Delia and Rocco leaves us with a profound lesson, that the most frightening kind of poverty isn't an empty bank account, but a soul so impoverished that it can only judge people by the value of the clothes they wear or the house where they live. That dignity isn't a reward reserved for the wealthy or powerful, but a fundamental right belonging to every human being, regardless of who they are or where they stand in society. And that when a powerful voice rises to accuse someone who has little power of their own, what we must do isn't rush to judgment, but pause, listen, and search for the truth, because money may buy the loudest microphone in the room, but it can never turn a lie into the truth forever. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like and share this video, so you can continue joining us each day for more meaningful and compelling stories. And we would truly love to know how you feel about what you have just heard. Have you ever encountered honest people in real life who were treated as unfairly as Delia? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep within your heart so that we and the other viewers can listen and understand together. Thank you for taking the time to stay with us until the very final moment. We wish everyone watching this video lasting good health, joy in each new day, and a peaceful, hopeful heart. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in our next videos.